Hey, Shalom. First off, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Barakakadash. I want to give double honors to the apostles, elders, and bishops of GMS who have taught us this word and teach us this word today. And I want to give a salutation unto the elect of the nation of Israel. This is the brother Yatazakba with the GMS Nebraska camp. And in this lesson, what I want to get into is this article. Recent news. Right, I have this from AP News. This article is titled "Trump Threatens Russia with Tariffs and Boosts U.S. Weapons for Ukraine." Now, what Trump wants to do, he wants to bring peace between, the war with Russia and Ukraine. And so what he's threatening to do is that if Russia doesn't bring peace within the next 50 days, if they don't stop their attacks, stop their war front, then he's going to, enact tariffs. Now we're going to get into this article, break some things down, and get into the details, and go into prophecy on why, Trump will not be able to accomplish peace, and, the possible turmoil from this situation in regards to biblical prophecy. Now let's go ahead and get into it. It says, President Donald Trump on Monday threatened Russia with steep tariffs and announced a rejuvenated pipeline for American weapons to reach Ukraine, hardening his stance toward Moscow after months of frustration about unsuccessful negotiations for ending the war. It says the latest steps reflect an evolving approach from the Republican president. Now, I want to mention, it says that, this is after months of frustration about unsuccessful negotiations for ending the war. And the reason why, Trump trying to end this war has been repeatedly unsuccessful is because it's a part of the Lord's will that Russia would be in the spirit that they're in right now, and that they would, be head first in doing what they want to do. We're going to grab the scripture here shortly, but we read in Ezekiel chapter 38 about Gog, which is Russia, about how the Lord will put hooks into Gog's jaws. And what that means is that the Lord is going to put a spirit in Russia, or the leader of Russia, to be in a Soviet Union type mindset, to be in the mindset of not backing down, to be in a mindset of being war ready, not not being in a spirit of peace and a spirit of doing what the U.S. wants them to do. And this is what we see going on with Putin right now, because we have to look at the whole reason why he wants Ukraine in the first place, and why he is so gun-ho about getting Ukraine. Well, Ukraine was a part of Russia during the Soviet Union. Ukraine was a Soviet territory, and now Putin wants to reclaim Russia, or Slovakia. Putin wants to reclaim Ukraine as a part of Russia, which is why he is going and doing this war front, which is reasonable. That's what he wants to do. But then you have Trump, who is encroaching in that business that Putin has going on, and he's stirring things up. And while he's talking about he's trying to make peace, what he's really doing is agitating the situation. And I want to grab Habakkuk chapter 2 verse 5, because it says, "Yea, also because he transgresseth by wine, he is a proud man, neither keepeth at home, who enlargeth his desire as hell, and is as death, and cannot be satisfied, but gathereth unto him all nations, and heapeth unto him all people." And this scripture is descriptive of America. It says, neither keepeth at home, who enlargeth his desire as hell. Well, we look at the U.S., and, the U.S. has military bases all over the world, next to all these different countries that are in opposition to the U.S. And what we see going on, and this point that I'm about to bring out, I was first made privy to this by the elder Raib here in the Nebraska camp. But when we look at a map over there in Europe, in West Asia, We see Finland, Sweden. We see all these countries. We see Russia, and then we see all these countries to the left of Russia, bordering Russia. Now, almost every single one of these countries are in the EU or aligned with the US. The only country that you see over here that isn't aligned with the US, that's directly bordering Russia, is Belarus, this blue one right here. But other than that, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all these countries are US aligned. And now we see Trump, while Ukraine isn't necessarily in NATO or the EU, we see America, basically getting good with Ukraine, sending all that money over there to fight back against Russia, sending defenses to them, and basically moving in the direction of being aligned with the U.S. And what we see is that the U.S. is trying to completely border Russia with strategic points of basically outposts against Russia. And the mindset that Putin is in is that he doesn't want U.S. encroaching on Russia's territory in the fashion that they are. And so Ukraine is a very important spot in the eyes of Putin, not only for what we just spoke about, but also because, like I mentioned before, Ukraine was already a part of Russia during the Soviet Union, and it's very important ideologically and politically to Putin that he reclaims Ukraine in the face of everything that Trump and the U.S. is doing in regards to Ukraine. But let's go back to the article. It says the latest steps reflect an evolving approach from the Republican president, who promised to swiftly resolve the war started by Russian President Vladimir Putin when he invaded Ukraine 3 years ago. Trump once focused his criticism on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, whom he described as unwilling to compromise, but more recently has expressed growing irritation toward Putin. He says, my conversations with him are very pleasant, and then the missiles go off at night. He complained that it just keeps going on and on and on. And so, what Trump has been saying is that he'll talk to Putin on the phone, and Putin will be, talking nice. He'll be like, okay, we can come to some sort of peace agreement, but then they'll get off the phone and the war will continue. More bombs keep getting dropped. The war keeps going on. And why is that? That's because the Lord has the spirit in Putin to where, he's not gonna just stop. The scriptures say that, let's get that real fast. In Proverbs, I believe chapter 20, verse 1. Nope. Proverbs, let's just look it up like this. A king's heart. Okay, Proverbs 21:1. It says, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord Yahweh. As the rivers of water, he turneth it whithersoever he will. So he's putting, the thought in the mind of Putin to go forward with his plan. Even despite Trump's, threats, even despite all these ceasefire agreements. This is why every time we hear about a ceasefire, every time we hear about some type of buffer being put in the way of this war, we, us prophets, we know that it's only temporary, or we know that it's going to fall through. Why? Well, let's go to Ezekiel 38, as I mentioned before. Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 2. It says, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Now, as I spoke of before, Gog is representative of Russia. It says, and say, thus saith the Lord Yahweh, behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth in all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. So we're seeing that Russia is going to be put in a warlike mindset. And ultimately, Russia is going to mount up a war against the U.S. But we're at a low point, right now, to where, we don't see the U.S. and Russia fighting directly, but we see it getting real close because Russia is going into Ukraine. And what do we see the U.S. doing? Supplying Ukraine with defenses, supplying Ukraine with weapons, supplying Ukraine with the ability to fight back against Russia. And the U.S. is getting dangerously close to, ultimately what is slated to come to pass. But let's go back to the article. It says Trump said he would implement severe tariffs unless a peace deal is reached within 50 days. He provided few details on how they would be implemented, but he described them as secondary tariffs, meaning they would target Russia's trading partners in an effort to isolate Moscow and the global economy. So what they're saying here is that Trump is going to implement secondary tariffs. What's a secondary tariff? Basically, what Trump is talking about doing is that anybody that trades with Russia, anything that those countries that trade with Russia, anything that they try to sell to the U.S. is going to be made very expensive for the U.S. to buy, which what that will do is make U.S. businesses look elsewhere to buy those different resources and those different goods. And that's going to make those countries, it is going to, mess up their pockets. It's going to mess up their money. And so what Trump is hoping to do is that with that threat, those countries, if he was to implement those tariffs, those countries would stop trading with Russia so that they can continue to trade with the U.S. And that would isolate Russia, which would force Russia to have to, do peace agreements. Now, even though that's Trump's plan, that could backfire greatly because he has this, idea of how it will go in this perfect world on if he implements these tariffs. But there's more that will come from him implementing these tariffs, because if you put, if you make it hard for, countries to trade with you, if they trade with Russia, and forcing countries to stop trading with Russia, well, that affects the EU, because the EU gets their oil and different things from Russia, and they need to continue to do that. And so if you start, based off the rules that Trump is setting, that means that he would have to put tariffs on the EU. And if he puts tariffs on the EU, which the EU is supposed to be the U.S. partners, but if he puts tariffs on the EU, that means that the EU has already said that they would have to put tariffs on the U.S. in retaliation, and there would start a trade war between the U.S. and the EU, and they're supposed to be economic partners. And another backlash that could come from that move that Trump is talking about making is that, let's say that people do stop trading with Russia. If Russia's oil becomes harder to buy, what that's going to do is it's going to raise oil prices, which that's going to make, gas more expensive for the consumer here in the U.S. All in all, the different things that can come from this threat that Trump is talking about making, it's going to affect a lot more than what he, intends for it to, or what, in his good idea, it's going to happen. And within that, like I mentioned before, he's going to end up affecting the EU. And different countries in the EU are already speaking out about how what Trump is doing is irresponsible and, a bad move. The foreign minister of Denmark has spoken about how, Trump is being irresponsible. And this lines up with what precept? Let's grab Revelation chapter 17, verse 16. Which says, and the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore. Now, these 10 horns are representative of the EU countries, and the whore is representative of America. It says, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. So what's being prophesied is that eventually, the EU is going to, NATO and EU is going to turn against the U.S., and that's going to result because, well, we see an example here with what Trump is doing, where he's making rash decisions and he's doing things because he wants to be credited with bringing peace to Ukraine, and he's, dipping his finger in, business that doesn't concern him, but it's affecting, his so-called partners, to the point where, he could start a trade war between, himself and his partners, to the point where he's gonna hurt his partner's economy. And so different decisions like this, you would think Trump would touch bases with his partners in the EU and see, what ideas they have, see what he can do instead that won't affect them as bad. But he's not doing that. And what that's doing is that it's straining the relationship between the US and the EU, which is ultimately going to lead to this prophecy. Not this situation alone is going to lead to this prophecy, but this, along with other things, is all culminating to, the EU, hating America and being a part of those countries that turn on the US and shoot missiles over here, and destroy the US, but we know that these things are going to happen. Like I mentioned before, we know when these different ceasefire agreements are going to fall apart. We know when the opposite thing is going to happen. Why? Because the scriptures say in Isaiah chapter 51 verse 11. No, I believe it's what chapter is it? Salakia 55 and 11. Isaiah chapter 55 verse 11. It says, "So shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth." Now, this is the Lord Yahweh. He's saying that, his word that goeth forth out of his mouth. What's his word? His word is these scriptures. His word is these prophecies. This is the will of the Lord that we see taking place right in front of us. It says that it shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereto I sent it. So all these prophecies that we read in the scriptures are the will of the Lord. And when, these prophecies are laid out, and that's the Lord saying that this is going to happen. And that's how we know that no matter what pops up that seems like it's moving in the opposite direction of prophecy, or seem like it's going to upset prophecy, it won't. Because up to this point, every single prophecy has come to pass, and the Lord's word is faithful and true. So we know that every prophecy after is going to come to pass. So that's how we know that Russia is going to continue in that warlike mindset, as well as, let's grab this precept, Isaiah 13 and 17. It says, "Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them." This is speaking about Russia. It says, "Which shall not regard silver, and as for gold, they shall not delight in it." And what this scripture is saying is that there's not going to be no type of trade agreement that the US is going to be able to make with Russia to fend them off, or to try to die down that warlike spirit. The Lord is going to put a spirit in Russia to where they're going to be they're going to want the US wiped off the map. They're going to continue to go forth with what they want to do. And it says here that they ain't going to care about the money. They ain't going to care about diplomacy. They're not going to care about peace. And we see that same spirit within what Putin is doing. He'll get on the phone with Trump. They have a nice conversation, and the war continues on. These tariffs that Trump is, threatening, Putin is not worried about that. And even if this does put a pause in the war for a small moment, we're going to see it pick right back up, because the Lord is going to stir up his spirit. So let's read a little bit more of this article, and then we can close out the lesson. It says, in addition, Trump said European allies would buy billions and billions of dollars of U.S. military equipment to be transferred to Ukraine, replenishing the besieged country's supplies of weapons. He made the announcement in the Oval Office alongside NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. It says, included in the plan are Patriot air defense systems, a top priority for Ukraine as it fends off Russian drones and missiles. It says, doubts were recently raised about Trump's commitment to supply Ukraine when the Pentagon paused shipments over concerns that U.S. stockpiles were running low. And, that's essentially the point. A lot of things are repeated in this article of, things that we talked about already. But, that's essentially the point, and there were talks recently about, Ukraine joining NATO instead of being annexed by Russia, but if Ukraine joins NATO, well, we have to keep in mind that NATO has an agreement that if one country goes to war, all the other countries have to go and back that country up. And Ukraine is in the middle of war with Russia right now. So if Ukraine joins NATO, America is going to be, swept along in that. They're going to have to go and fight Russia. So that's not going to happen. But we see that America is doing basically everything but, treating Ukraine as an official NATO partner. And so it's only a matter of time before, things swell to the point of an overboil, and war ramps up further than just in that region. Not only do we have the war going on between Russia and Ukraine, but let's keep in mind everything going on with Israel and Iran, and America dipping their fingers in that. Things are gonna come to a boil, because remember, Russia is at the defense of Iran, as the scriptures prophesy as well in Ezekiel chapter 38. We'll get that real fast, and then we'll close the lesson out. Now, Ezekiel 38 and verse 5, it says, Persia and Ethiopia and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. This is countries that is naming that Russia is going to be in a partnership with in wartime and in the end. And the first country that it names is Persia, which is the modern day Persians are the Iranians. So it says Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer, which is modern day Turkey, is the modern day Gomer, and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, which is Turkey as well, and all his bands and many people with thee. Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. It's saying that the Lord is going to make Russia a guard to these countries, including, what was the first place? Persia or Iran. And with America, funding Israel's, war efforts against Iran, and, getting into direct contact with Iran, bombing their nuclear sites, eventually Russia is going to get involved. Whether it be Trump or whoever it is, America is going to do too much, and a war is going to break out, and that's going to lead to the destruction of Babylon the Great, the destruction of America. But Lord willing, this lesson was edifying. Once again, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahawah. I want to give double honors to the apostles and elders of GMS, apostle, elders, and bishops of GMS, and a salutation unto the elect. Shalom.